Thank you for joining us today for another episode of Talks for Christ. I'm your host, Bruce Oliver. You have our promise to do our best to make the next few minutes of your time well spent. Our special guest has prepared to share a blessing with you. So let's jump in and get started. Our engine is warmed up and we are now leaving the station. Buckle up as we are beginning our Talks for Christ journey. Today, we're honored to have Mike McDonald with us. Mike is the Director of Communications for the Catholic League for Religious and Civil Rights. Since joining in 2020, he's authored major reports and appeared on various TV and radio programs. Before that, he served in the Trump administration and worked on Capitol Hill for Florida representatives. We'll be discussing some pressing issues around religious liberty in our nation and in New York State. Let's get our discussion rolling. Mike, it's so good to have you with us today, and I would like to address a press release that came across my desk recently. But first, let me ask you a question or two. What do you see happening to religious liberty across our nation and in New York State?
Well, thanks, Pastor Bruce. It's good to be with you today. The state of religious liberty in America today is at an inflection point. We really are at a tipping point one way or the other. In Washington, D.C. right now, the Biden-Harris administration is perhaps the most antithetical administration to religious liberty of any sort. They've been completely hostile to people of faith. Just speaking as a Catholic, one of the big things that we've had to deal with at the Catholic League in the past couple of years is with the FBI spying on traditional Catholics, trying to get people into the parishes to be undercover agents, trip sources for information, to gather on just Catholics going about their business, going to church. So that's been a huge problem that we've had. Every Christian denomination's been impacted by this, at least the ones that still take the call of our Lord to protect life seriously. Since the Dobbs decision, the attacks on pro-life pregnancy resource centers has been just a major blow. And yes, okay, a lot of that is coming from street thugs, but these street thugs are mostly getting away. The last time I checked, about a month ago, only 4 people have been charged, and nearly 100 pro-life crisis pregnancy centers have been vandalized, burnt down, attacked violently, and only 4 people out of nearly 100 have been brought to justice. This administration is looking the other way. Then if you get into the state level, here in New York, it's bad. It is a stronghold of secularists. This is one of the most secular states in the country. As a result, there's currently a proposition that's going to be up for election this year, Proposition 1. They've given it a very nice, fluffy name about changes because whatever polls best that day. They're calling it the Equality Freedom Amendment. It's going to upend civil rights law in New York State, create a whole bunch of new categories for gender identity, taking it from what it was in the 1960s where it was race, religion, creed, color, and just adding in a whole bunch of other unnecessary categories that are covered already in numerous other pieces of legislation at the state level and the federal level. It's also going to enshrine the right to abortion in the New York State Constitution. Throw scare quotes around rights there because it's not really a right. The secularists in New York seem to believe it is. We are at a tipping point, and what we really need now is people of faith to take action, to put their faith into action, to have the courage of their convictions, to feel that call and answer yes, and boldly take a stand and say that this country is still a God-fearing people.
Thank you so much. I can see where people should be concerned about this Proposition 1. That's not already done yet, right? Or is it cooking, or has it already been? Or
it is up for election in November. So when everyone goes to the polls in November, we will find out. But it's looking like it's probably going to be a done deal. The polling on it is not great. It's about 3-1 in favor of it passing, and it's just going to be terrible. On top of the things I mentioned before on abortion and all these, it's going to undermine parental rights. Essentially, the parents will not know in the state of New York what their children are doing while they're at school. It is going to be extremely detrimental to have any oversight of your child at all.
Your press release says that every survey shows most Americans do not consider Donald Trump as being a particularly devout Christian. Are there reasons why people of faith should stand by the previous president when people feel this way?
I think there's a lot of good reason. I don't just say this because I did 4 years in the Trump administration. Was a great president, but one of the things that does not get enough credit is how he boldly stood up for religious liberty. He may not go to church every Sunday, and he may not have what you would picture of as a most pious individual, but what he did for people of faith truly matters, and it made a difference in our ability to live out our faith, put our faith into action in the public square, which is fundamental to Christianity across the board. If you cannot put your faith into action, then you don't really have religious freedom, and that was something that Trump boldly stood up for. I know when I was working in the administration, one of the things that was a big push was to find ways to partner with religious groups. In the past, other presidents have done this, going back to pretty much W. He really started the ball rolling on this. In the past, it was, okay, we'll just find a Christian soup kitchen and give them some money to help feed the hungry. A good thing, but there would be all these red tape that would come along with it, the bureaucracy, really saying, oh, well, actually, you can't have a cross up in the soup kitchen because that could offend the people you're feeding, so you're going to have to take that down. Whereas with the Trump administration, it very much was, you got a cross up, fine. You want to put 10 up, be my guest. Whatever you're doing to help people is a good thing, and we're not going to get in your way. And that was a monumental change that allowed people of faith to get involved and make a difference. So I would say that that's hugely important, because it's not just that you can go to church on Sunday, which is great. Everyone should go to church on Sunday. But if you then just check out from your faith for the rest of the week, your faith isn't really that strong. So I would say that is a huge thing, the ability to actually live your faith. If you compare it to what's going on today with the pro-life advocates that are being hunted by this Department of Justice, how many of these people are looking at 10, 20 years in prison for praying outside an abortion clinic? You didn't have that under the Trump administration. You were able to live your faith, act on your faith, and that is hugely important to all people of faith.
Oh, my goodness. You are laying on some heavy information for our listeners today, and for me personally. Let me jump into another question. I can't wait to ask you this one. Your press release suggests that Christians who like Trump are mature voters. Can you give our audience an idea what this means?
This comes down to, if you look at this in multiple surveys, the secular elite in this country look down on people of faith. They do not like us. In the Democratic Party, atheists and Muslims are preferred over Catholics, which is a huge upending of the usual political order of things going back in the 70s, that the Catholics are no longer welcome in the Democratic Party, according to their rank-and-file members. They look at all people of faith as being kind of simple. Oh, they just believe in their little fairy tales. Just let them be. They're very quaint. They'll do their own little thing. And to appease them, all you have to do is get somebody like Joe Biden, who can pull his rosary beads out of his pocket and, oh, look at him, he goes to church on Sunday. And they think we're that simple, that we will fall for this. But I don't care about that. I don't care what Joe Biden personally believes. I don't care what Donald Trump personally believes. What matters to me as a person of faith is my ability to live out my faith, to put my faith into action. That is the most important thing to me. And when you compare Trump to Biden, the choice is clear. It is a clear choice between the two of them. You've got Trump, who will let you live out your faith and provide for religious liberty, and multiple executive orders, multiple other actions from the administration to advance high priority positions of people of faith. Whereas you have the Harris-Biden administration that is hostile to those outcomes. People of faith in general tend to be much more mature about these things. They don't fall for the identity politics of it. We don't just look at somebody as like, oh, okay, well, he goes to church on Sundays, so he must also be a good person like me, and I'm just going to blindly vote for someone who acts like me. People of faith are much smarter than that, and realize where their priorities actually lie. And your faith means something to you, and you want to live out your faith. You're going to choose the person that's going to help you to do that. People of faith, not being fooled by their con game, the identity politics, are much more sophisticated, much more mature. They're like, I'm not falling for this nonsense that the secularists keep pushing, that they can send in somebody who acts like us but undermine everything that we believe in. So hats off to the people of faith, and obviously that has to be rooted in some sort of moral tradition, the ability to see through that con game, because in the Bible you'll hear the false prophets coming out and trying to lead you astray. Well, people of faith know that and are not falling for that and looking for the person that is going to advance their interests.
Thank you so much. You've really nailed that very well. In June, you published a report called Biden and Trump on Religious Liberty. Can you please explain some of the highlights of this report to our listeners? Will this have something to do with comparing policies from each administration?
Yes, absolutely. I highly recommend going to our website, catholicleague.org. This is one of the many reports that we've put out this year, and this was both one of the most challenging, most fun, and also most annoying reports I've ever done. I'm a strong proponent of religious liberty, but it took a long time typing up everything that Trump did. When it was all said and done, the Trump years were probably, as I mentioned before, the best years for religious liberty in this country. Year in, year out, there was always something that he did to achieve religious liberty, move the goalpost forward on that. So that took a lot of time to compile, whereas the Biden administration, looking at everything that they've done, they were very coy with their information. We have 6 buckets that we did things on, not to be overly partisan. They did do some things, but by and large, the Biden administration was more of returning to the past, a good soup kitchen that can partner with HUD and HHS to receive grant money. That'll be good for them. And they did a lot on protecting minority faiths. It used to be the Jewish faith was protected, but then the war with Palestine, and they kind of changed their tune on that anti-Semitism. All of the minority faiths, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, native tribal religions, they did things to harden their security, protect them, which are good things. As a person of faith, there is a lot more that you could do to advance those issues, and they did not. On the pro-life side, Trump was probably the most pro-life president we ever had. Yes, he appointed a lot of justices to the Supreme Court, to the federal court system that helped defend life, but even like simple things that are kind of get lost in the minutia of what goes on in the government. There's a lot of things that go on. But like that was a central issue. Like they're making treaties at the UN. Like, hey guys, we really want to cut back on how many abortions we provide for overseas. We want to make sure that all the development money that we send out to developing countries aren't subsidizing abortions. Like, let's make sure that that is in line with our values. So really good stuff. A lot of it is technical, but still important, because if you don't have the technical framework to put religious liberty into action, it's just not going to happen. And so Trump did a lot of things on that. I believe when it was all said and done, Trump had like 10 pages worth, and the Biden administration had 2. So just keeping that as a little bit more of a visual. A stack of paper, 10 high versus 2 pages, and it's really like a page and a half for the Biden administration. It is very clear between those 2 administrations which one cared about religious liberty, actually did the work to make sure that people of faith were not being persecuted, were able to stand up for life, able to put their faith into action. Religious liberty, all of those good things that we like, the Trump administration squarely stood behind, and the Biden administration did not. One of the things that still shocks me to this day was undermining Trump regulations that made it easier to partner with faith-based providers. Where I mentioned before, right, the Trump administration was, you want to have a cross in your soup kitchen, fine, go ahead. Whereas the Biden administration says, well, you know what, you're probably going to offend somebody with that cross, so let's cover that up, take that down. If you want to stay in the grant program, I mean, we're not telling you have to cover it up, but if you want to keep getting federal funds, that's what you'll do. And so as a result, you have the Trump administration actively advancing religious liberty, and on the other hand, you had the Biden administration that did some marginal things. They did provide some extra funding for minority faiths to make sure that they weren't being persecuted against, but actively worked against people of faith, worked against Christians, trying to put their faith into action. Extremely secularized, had multiple meetings with atheists and LGBT groups, oppose religious liberty reform. People of faith recognize this. They can look at it and say, Donald Trump did a lot of good things for people of faith. Joe Biden, not so much. My interests are with my religious liberty, so I'm going to vote for Trump. Trump has a record of defending religious liberty. Biden and Harris have a record of undermining and working against religious liberty.
Wow, thank you so much, Mike. That was a really good commentary about what's going on. And I'm glad to be talking with somebody that was over there in the Trump administration that knew and could see what was going on. So you're not just saying stuff, you're talking about stuff that you actually experienced personally and you saw, and the outcome is quite different than what we've just been experiencing. Now, Mike, I really am excited about asking this question because I want to learn something here. Can you give our listeners and myself an idea of what the 1993 Religious Freedom Restoration Act is all about? And does the Equality Act, co-sponsored by Harris, offer more religious freedom for Americans?
So the Religious Freedom Act of 93 was a pivotal moment in American history. It really reaffirms the First Amendment as regarding religious liberty. Hugely important. And not to go too deep into the details here, but just previous, what was it, a year or two before, the Supreme Court said you don't really have to respect religious liberty, providing that it is applied across the board. I'm drawing a blank on the name of the case. It was an employment case. Two guys were using peyote and got fired from their jobs because they failed the drug test. And as part of our faith, we needed to have the peyote and commune with the spirits and all that. And the Department of Employment said, well, you know what, actually, we kind of apply that across the board to everybody, so that doesn't really apply here. You're fired. And the Supreme Court said, actually, that's right. If it's a broad ruling, you don't have to respect religious liberty. So that kind of would have trickled down into other things. My wife wears a cross constantly, but when she was working in the hospital as a nurse, if they said, we have a policy of no jewelry, you can't wear the cross, you have to take it off. That is what that was setting up. The Religious Liberty Restoration Act, RFRA, was designed to combat that, to say that people of faith cannot be discriminated against. That's the whole point of the First Amendment. You have the freedom to live out your faith. If people of faith are being burdened, it is up to the federal government to make the workaround, not to make people of faith have to comply and be burdened by regulations. So that was hugely important and received massive support in the 90s, bipartisan support. Nancy Pelosi, Chuck Schumer, all voted for it. Bill Clinton signed it into law. Fast forward to the last 5-10 years, the Democratic Party has moved in a completely different direction, fully embraced the most radical secularist position, and is now openly hostile to faith. One of the big bills they have been pushing is the Equality Act. Kamala Harris, when she was in the Senate, was one of the co-sponsors of the Equality Act, and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops has described the Equality Act as the single most dangerous piece of legislation to religious liberty. This is hugely destructive, very much like we were talking about Proposition 1 earlier. The whole point is to upend civil rights laws. The Equality Act would force Catholic hospitals to perform abortions and sex change procedures, would compel Catholic churches and other traditional churches that recognize that marriage is defined as between a man and a woman. To break that is extremely, extremely dangerous. It specifically exempts itself from RFRA. Essentially, just keep it simple, we don't have to follow RFRA. Sincerely, the U.S. Congress. So on that alone, is extremely problematic because when you start undermining laws like that, pretty much something that was designed to be an emergency break to stop the federal government from undermining rights, when you start cutting away at that safeguard foundation that we have, you're just going to open up the floodgates and start watering down religious liberty. These are hugely important issues. They're still alive today. People of faith need to not just, we've been talking about this, living out your faith, but you got to look at some of these other bigger issues because they are going to come and interfere with how you live out your faith. I know it's easy for me, I'm an activist, to stay on top of this stuff. Just the regular Joe sitting in the pews, you got to pay attention to because this is how you lose your country, this is how you lose your freedom, and ultimately you end up in some sort of 1984 type dystopia where religion is completely outlawed. Like, look at the Soviets, look at China. These are real things that can happen, and the best solution is to make sure that people of faith are involved and engaged. And yeah, it is stuff that's in the weeds. This is how the system was designed. Bad people are taking advantage of it to play little shell games here and there to sort of say, oh, we're just advancing equality and freedom. But in reality, a lot of these things are designed to target you as a person of faith to make sure that you are marginalized and sidelined and have less of a voice in your own country. But to make sure that doesn't happen, you got to be extra vocal now and stand up for what you believe in.
Well, thank you so much for explaining all that to us. And you're right, there's a lot of what I call lay people sit in the pews, but they don't really know what's going on in Washington. I know their pocketbooks can feel it today. They are needing to become more aware of their surroundings.
I'm not necessarily saying that that's a good thing, that people have to start paying attention to stuff. I'm not like one of these like, oh, where have you all been? We've been fighting this for years. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that people in power in Washington are taking advantage of good people of faith that actually have to work for a living, that, like you're saying, they're feeling in their pocketbooks, probably taking an extra job, part-time job, just to make ends meet. I get it. Like, times are not good right now, and it's not anyone sitting in the pews' fault. Like, they're busy just trying to keep their heads above water. Some of this stuff is technical. It is in the weeds. You have to make that stand now. If you don't, you're not going to be able to do it in the future. And so, yeah, it is really hard. Check out our website, like I mentioned before, CatholicLeague.org. Like, we stay on top of this stuff and boil it down to give you the tools and resources to fight. That's one of the best things that we do, is when somebody is particularly egregious in going after people of faith, we'll put out their email. We'll put out the phone number so that you can get in contact with them. Just click a link on your phone, it'll dial it for you, and say, hey, whoever is particularly being mean to the Catholics, being mean to the Christians, we don't like this. You need to stop this. And that's very powerful when they get bombarded by emails, bombarded by phone calls. Yes, it does require more work, but if you love your country, if you love your faith, you will stand up and do the right thing and make sure that that's here for prosperity.
Wow, that's really great. We know time is kind of running out. So let me jump on this other question. The last line of your interesting press release says, persona matters, but policies matter more. That's the mature way of sizing up candidates for public office. Could you give us a nutshell of what this is supposed to mean?
Yeah, the personality of who's running for office definitely matters. We don't necessarily want somebody that has, I don't know, Bill Clinton's type morals. We don't want someone like that running the country, or a politician that's maybe potentially been taking bribes for a nearly 50-year career in Washington running the country. That's something to be concerned about. But not so much on the people of faith. They tend to actually be very good voters. A lot more of these average Joe types, they look at it like, I'm going to vote for the candidate that I think would be the most fun with. Listen, I've worked in Washington. I've met Trump. I've met a lot of people of Congress. Some of them are interesting. Some of them are not. I don't necessarily think we should be deciding our politics based on, oh, you know what, that guy seems like a lot of fun. Yeah, I mean, he could be a lot of fun, but do you trust him to to run the country, that doesn't matter to me if they're fun, more empathetic, any of these touchy-feely adjective types. That doesn't matter. What matters to me and what matters to most people of faith are what policies you're going to pursue, what you're going to do to make an impact on my life. Some people look at their pocketbooks more than other issues. Fine, if that's what you want to consider that. Consider this person's going to be good for inflation, bad for taxes, what have you, if that's it. But look at it more maturely. Look at the policies. Don't just say, oh, that guy looks like he's going to be the life of the party. No, you really shouldn't be fans of politicians, right? It's not like this is a sporting event. It is about what policies people are going to put into action that impact your life. And for people of faith that are deeply concerned about religious liberty, there is a record between the Trump administration, and you can compare that with the record of the Biden-Harris administration. One was very good, and the Trump administration that did a lot to advance religious liberty and put actual policies to work that made a difference on the ground, versus an administration that did very little and frequently would work against people of faith. When you look at that, you might say, well, you know what, Kamala, she's kind of fun. She likes to dance around. I don't care. I don't care how much fun she is. I don't care how inspiring or lack thereof her word salads are. I care about what policies she's going to put into action. Trump, he's gruff. He's mean. He's nasty. He's the bad orange man. He can be the baddest orange man in the world for all I care. The policies that he pursued in his first term were great for people of faith. And as a Catholic, as a Christian, as a believer in Christ, that matters to me a lot. That he stood up for religious liberty, defended life, and allowed me to put my faith into action in the public square without fear of retaliation. See, to say, hey, you can't pray outside of an abortion clinic. Donald Trump did so much for people of faith, and that wasn't because of his personality. That wasn't because he's a Bible-thumping Christian that goes to church on Sundays. His personal flaws don't matter. The policies that he pursues are what really matter. And when you look at it, people of faith had a champion and an advocate for their cause, something that they rarely had in Washington during the Trump years. And then you have Kamala, who's more empathetic, but the policies she's pursuing are going to undermine your religious liberty. So it is very simple. You got to be smart, look into the issues, and decide. But what matters most is the policies that they're going to pursue, not necessarily their personal defects or their personal triumphs. The policies are what matter.
Thank you so much for all of that information. And I agree with you. Policies do matter. Ladies and gentlemen, our train is actually slowing down. That means it's getting ready to enter the station. We're just about closing this wonderful podcast out with Michael McDonald. It's been a very interesting podcast today. But I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll have to come back to other issues again in the near future. Michael, here's the question for you. What do you really want people to take away from today's podcast? Is there something that you would like to leave with them as a golden nugget for them to remember?
Looking at all these things big picture, it's very easy to get bogged down into the slogans and, oh, this was a one-off issue that, what was it, like in 2004 when W was running, the NASCAR dads are very security-minded, working middle class white dads. They matter. Okay, it's easy to get bogged down in all that stuff. But looking at things from a broader perspective, as most people of faith do, there are two fundamental rights: the right to life and your conscience rights, your religious liberty. Those two are your fundamental rights, because without those, you don't have any other rights. And to a person of faith, those two are of the utmost importance, to make sure that we are defending those constantly. When you get down to it, those two are fundamentally important, and you only have those rights if you are able to go out into the public square and put your faith into action, because without that, everything else is just cheap. I want to be able to live my faith to act on my faith. My faith guides me in most decisions that I make. Without the ability to exercise those rights, to enjoy those rights, I would be less of a person than I am today. So when it comes to making a decision on the future of the country, you really have to ask which person is going to do the most to defend life and defend religious liberty. Those two are hugely important to all people of faith, and you have to make sure that you're educated, that you know what's going on. Again, check out our website, CatholicLeague.org. We do a lot in the religious liberty space, a lot in the life space, a lot of good things to see there, and get involved any way that you can, because if you don't stand up for these rights now, you cannot guarantee that you'll have them in the future. Right? The good Lord helps those who help themselves. And right now is our time to help ourselves, to stick up for our faith, to stick up for what we believe in, and make sure that the right people can be our advocates. I worked in Washington for a while. So few people, even on the Republican side of the aisle, care about religious liberty questions, life questions, these moral, cultural questions. During the Trump years, we actually had somebody that stood up for those issues. And that is a rarity in Washington. And so if you have the opportunity to make sure that these issues that matter to you have an actual champion defending them, supporting them, promoting them in the halls of power, you really need to take advantage of it, because it doesn't come along that often. And if you don't do it now, then the two fundamental rights, life and religious liberty, are going to be undermined. So just keep all of that in mind as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was excellent. That wraps up our conversation with Mike McDonald. We're so thankful that he took time to be with us today. His insights on religious liberty and the current political climate have given us plenty to ponder. Which is better, to give a blind eye to the decisions our elected officials hand us, or let our voices be heard, and especially at the ballot box? It is time to do our part to help protect religious freedom by carefully comparing the policies of people we elect. Tune in next time for more engaging conversations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I want to leave you with my favorite quote: "With God, I can face tomorrow and experience His peace today." Hope to see you here for our next episode of Talks for Christ. This is your host, Dr. Bruce Oliver, signing off for now. Don't forget, Jesus loves you. It has been great to have you join us for today's podcast. Did you just receive a blessing? If so, would you leave us your comments and questions about today's subject? Check out our podcast directory and join us for another guest speaker real soon. May God richly bless you.